Brydon Coverdale is a journalist, he's been a successful TV quiz show contestant, and now he is one of the chasers on the Australian version of The Chase. I caught up with him to find out about his story. Okay, welcome Brydon the Shark Coverdale to All Things Quiz.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. Good to be with you.
Great to have you. Now, back in May, you published The Quizmasters, Inside the World of Trivia, Obsession, and $1 Million Prizes. You could easily have just written a celebrity biography because your journey from teenage quizzer to TV chaser is really interesting. But what you've done is weave that story around some of the history of Australian quiz shows, interviewed quiz contestants and other people in other figures from Australian quiz history. Why did you go down the more difficult route?
Well, I guess I never really set out for it to be a memoir or an autobiography, really, because the reality is I'm not somebody who's probably going to sell a lot of autobiographies. But what I am is I'm a journalist. I'm by profession I am a writer, an interviewer. And I'm also obviously a pretty obsessive quizzer. So I wanted to write the book that I wanted to read, and the book that I wanted to read was about the story of Australian quizzing, quiz shows, other aspects of the Australian sort of quiz industry, like pub trivia and radio quizzes, that sort of thing. And there was just a lot of, I knew there were a lot of interesting stories to be told, and it hasn't really been done in a book before. So I just sort of thought, well, I suppose really, given my profession and my interest, I'm probably the person who should be writing this. So that's what I did.
And they are interesting stories. And I think what's important, I mean, I've read through the book, and I'm not familiar with Australian TV quiz history. Some of the shows we've had over here, some we haven't, but it does resonate, I think, with a lot of people, or it will resonate with a lot of people throughout the quiz community, because quizzes are of a type. We can recognize the sorts of characters you're talking about, and we can equate things you talk about in shows and experiences. So I think it's got a broad appeal, and I really enjoyed reading about that. And a lot of quizzes are going to recognize that moment when they first thought, hey, I could be good at this thing, or at least this thing is the sort of pastime that gives me a buzz. And you talk about being 15 years old and ringing up a radio quiz, and Issa Schultz was 16 when he won the same radio quiz, and it gave you an early taste of victory. But what on earth makes a 15-year-old call up a radio quiz that by all accounts loads of people listen to and is kind of well respected? What made you do that?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. And what I also wanted to say was, you're talking about, you might not necessarily know the shows. I've read all sorts of British quiz books, American ones, and it's the same with me. I don't necessarily know all the shows, but I just love and recognize those personalities. The radio quiz, it's on ABC national radio, which means it goes all over Australia and internationally, digitally, of course. It's a 25-question quiz that happens in the hour of midnight to 1 a.m. The sort of time when there's very little else going on. And the host in the sort of early 90s when it started, a guy called Tony Delroy, just set up this quiz where there was 5 categories, 5 questions in each category. They would basically just run the switchboard, and whoever was answered question 25 won the prize, which was a very small a CD or a magazine or something from the ABC shop. It really wasn't much, but it was the sort of thing that was just part of the culture. People listened to it, people knew about it. Even if they didn't listen to it, they were aware of it. And I was 15, 16 years old, living in a small country town in Australia, living on a dairy farm. All my older siblings had long since moved away to the city to study at university. So I was interested in quizzing, and I wanted to do it competitively, but there was no outlet. There was nothing that there was no like if we had the internet at that point, it was very early on. There was certainly nothing going on that I could do quizzing there. This was the one thing that I could actually call up from the comfort of my own home and just have a go at and see what happened. And I think I won it 2 or 3 times. Issa Schultz, the super nerd, he won it a handful of times as well. But it was just this almost like a community, really, because the same people would call over and over again, and you would get to know what was going on in their lives, because they'd have a little chat to Tony, the host, and it was just a little part of my life. I only sort of rang in for a period of a couple of years on and off when I was a teenager, but it really did just give me the quiz bug even more so, because it was that on the phone, on the old landline phone, and I could hear the little click when it was coming to me, and I was like, oh, I'm on national radio here. This is big, And I'm an introverted personality, but there's something about the competitiveness of that quiz scenario that I clearly enjoyed even from that age.
But so you say you wanted to get involved in quizzing, but what was it that led you there? There must have been something about your family background, perhaps. You got older siblings. Do they kind of push you on? Your parents? You talk in the book about going on holiday to Canberra and going to Parliament and buying a wall chart of prime ministers and something like that. So a love of learning, etc. But how much was that encouraged by your family environment?
Oh, very much so. My mum was a primary school teacher. She had a love of learning. On this family trip to Canberra, when I must have actually only been 5 years old, I think, but I must have shown an interest in the prime ministers, the portraits or something, because my parents bought me this, a wall poster essentially of all the prime ministers with their little portraits, and I memorized it. It was my party trick when I was at school. At school, I could reel them up. I could say, Barton, Deacon Watson, Reed, Deacon Fisher, Cook, Fisher, Hughes, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And look, I clearly just had the sort of brain that enjoyed learning those kinds of listy-based things. I was always really interested in things like dates and timelines, that sort of stuff. And having older siblings. I mean, my older siblings, played things like Trivial Pursuit, and I was trying to match it with them. I was, a lot younger than them, and so I was really having to, probably try and prove that I was able to play with them, in those grown up sort of games. And but I also, I guess, talking the book, that I think it all comes down to a curiosity, in my opinion, and that is the same thing that got me into journalism, which is that I'm curious about the world. I want to, if I see a story or a piece of information, I want to know more about it. I want to sort of read the story behind the story. And I think if you have that curious sort of mindset, while also probably having the kind of brain that the information can stick, it's quizzing is a pretty natural place to end up.
And you talk in the book about you didn't push yourself at cricket, and so were mediocre. You would enjoy playing, but you didn't go to great heights. But you did push yourself at quizzing. So, what was it about quiz in particular that pushed you to try harder, and that still in your teens go on possibly the biggest quiz show in Australia at the time?
I think it was just realizing that it was something that I was good at. So, at high school, for example, I was in the cricket team, I was in the footy team, I was decent, I wasn't terrible, but it was pretty obvious that I wasn't, going to make a career out of those sports or anything.
Yeah.
But at things like the high school trivia night, I was very good. I was clearly doing something there where if I set my mind to it, I could be at a higher level than most of the other people around me. And so I guess it's that positive reinforcement, I suppose, of going, oh, I'm actually potentially good at this. And it was probably also just I'm a competitive kind of person. I enjoy playing sports, and something like a quiz show like Sale of the Century, which is the one that
Mm.
I first went on when I was 19. That was, I know it wasn't necessarily as big a show in the UK or the US, but in Australia, it was the big quiz show on TV for 20 years. And everybody watched it. And that was a show that I sort of looked at, and I could see that it would be something that I would be potentially good at. And so I just set my mind to, that was my goal. I was like, I want to be a contestant on Sale of the Century. That's what I want to do.
But some people, and you will see this probably on the chase now, some people getting on the show is their objective. That's it. As soon as they step on set, tick. But you, it was more than that. You had your eye on a rather large prize, winning 8 shows. And what was really interesting was reading the book, and you're talking about buzzer technique and knowing that you buzz in when you know you're going to know the answer, or at the critical point just before the question master reads the giveaway part of the clue, but they will still say the next couple of words. That's a lot of wisdom for a 19-year-old to have observed, for the show and worked out. So you're presumably very, very kind of analytical when you're watching the show. You're not just playing along, you're actually thinking about the tactics.
Yeah, and I guess it's been the same on every quiz or game show that I've ever been on. There's always I've always just looked at it, I guess, from the point of view of how do I give myself the advantage here? As a sports person would do the same thing, and it's surprising to me how many people go on a show without even sort of thinking about that stuff. You don't, and you don't have to put in hours and weeks of training. It can be something as simple as just having a basic plan, and a lot of people don't do that. Sale of the Century, it was a show where you had to get the answer right, but you had to be first on the buzzer. It wasn't absolutely no use knowing the answers if you weren't first on the buzzer. So if you work backwards from that, you go, okay, how can I make sure I'm first on the buzzer? That's the fundamental sort of first thing you need to do to be successful on the show. And so, it was clear to me that you would still get a few words from the host after you pressed your buzzer. The host would say something like, "What's the capital city of?" And that's when you would press the buzzer, because they would then say the country name. They would say Denmark or whatever it was. And if you're someone who knew your capitals, you were then the person who had buzzed in, and you had that answer all to yourself. And everyone else was then sitting around going, "Oh, I knew that," but they weren't first in. So there's a lot of little things that I guess I just absorbed from watching so much of the show. It's not something that I sort of look back on now and go, "Oh, I was consciously making notes," but I think it's just it just sort of seeped in.
There's a lovely quote in the book where you say, if there's something in common with all quiz show champions, they've taken the opportunity seriously and prepared accordingly. So your advice to a would-be quiz champion is prepare accordingly, I guess, according to what you want to get out of it, what the stakes are, what the competition is, but to take it really, really seriously.
And every show is different. It's not going to be the same approach for every show as well.
Yeah. Now that it's your job to be a, do you still prepare and you wrote loads and loads of questions back when you're doing the game show circuit. Now has it changed how you prepare? Has it upgraded the level of preparation you do?
Yeah, it has. I mean, I probably look back now on some of my performances as a contestant on quiz shows, and I probably think, oh gee, I actually wasn't very prepared at all. I had some strategies and I'd done some preparation, but in reality, I've seen now the extreme lengths that some people will go to, and I think, well, gee, I was nowhere near that. But yeah, for the chase, I have to take it, I guess, more seriously, and to more of an extreme than I ever would have as a contestant, because back then I was just doing it as a hobby. I wasn't things like the quiz circuit, if you like. There was no such thing as that, certainly in Australia when I was doing this. There was a little bit of pub trivia you could go to. That was pretty much all. So I was just doing it for my own interests and, for quiz shows and that sort of thing. So these days with the Chase, it's a lot more targeted. I'll sort of, I might go long periods without doing a lot of preparation because we're not filming, and then a filming period will come along, and I'll sort of try to really get back into it for a period of time ahead of filming, and use sort of flashcard techniques and things. I write a lot of practice questions. That's what works for me. I find if I write it down, it's just going to stick. And a practice question that I wrote 6 years ago for preparing for the Chase might still stick now because I wrote it down. I also these days I also write quiz questions for the newspapers. So I'm writing nearly 150 questions a week for sort of newspapers and media. So that in itself is sort of almost enforced training as well, because it forces me to look at things that I might otherwise let slip, like the current pop charts, or things that I might forget about, or the awards ceremonies that have just been held last week. I'm like, all right, I'm going to write some questions from this, and so it's all fresh in mind. So that's the sort of stuff that I find works for me these days.
And while you're doing that, presumably you're also thinking, oh, that's the sort of thing that might come up on the Chase, because now you're perhaps in tune with the writers and what they because they'll be on the hunt for new questions. As well.
No question. Yeah, absolutely. And I think because I've done so much question writing work myself, I find that a lot of the time, there might be let's say the Emmy Awards that were just on recently. There's a lot of awards there, but I don't see the point in memorizing all of them. You look for things that you think stand out for some reason, and you think, the question writers might also think that stands out for some reason. So for us here in Australia, for example, that's the fact that a guy called Murray Bartlett won the best supporting actor for a series called The White Lotus. So there's things that you obviously kind of go, all right, well, that's a particular piece of information that will probably be a good chance of coming up on our show at some point. It's just thinking like a question writer, and that's probably not an easy thing for a lot of people to do, but writing so many practice questions, you do get to think that way, and it's incredibly helpful.
And again, in the book, you I thought you made a really, really perceptive point, which I hadn't potentially appreciated. And you talked about the problems or the challenge of writing questions back in the day, before the internet. And because you have to make sure that your questions are robust, you go to the only sources you've got. And the sources question writers had were Britannica and Guinness Book of Records and things like that. So it kept the canon narrow because there wasn't the pop culture references. And it was like, that for me was one of those kind of light bulb moments of, it wasn't just the fact that everybody liked asking and answering questions on capitals and currencies and prime ministers. It was because it was hard to verify the other stuff. Do you think that now that the canon is wider and there are so many more sources available, it's harder for the same old faces to dominate a quiz scene as perhaps there certainly was in the UK, sounds like there was in Australia, that you now have to know so much more? It's just harder to nail that stuff?
Yeah, I think so. I think if you were to get some of the great Australian TV quiz champions of the 70s, 80s, that sort of era, I think a lot of them would find these days that there was sort of so much pop culture, that kind of thing, that they would probably struggle a fair bit with that. And it's absolutely true. The sources that were used were very sort of classical in nature. That's the sort of stuff that was in a printed book that wasn't going to change anytime soon. So there was still a huge amount of stuff to study and learn, and probably certainly in Australia, some of the subjects were probably explored in more depth than they are now,
Mm.
because you might have to go deeper into mythology or certain things. Whereas these days, I think in my observations are that on Australian quiz shows, things tend to be covered a bit more shallowly, however much more broadly. So you don't need to know something in as minute a detail as you once did, but you've got to know a hell of a lot more things, more subjects. You've got to know the TV shows, the current music, all the current sporting winners of everything that there is. There was a show called Pick a Box, was the big Australian quiz show on TV in the 60s. And I watched quite a few episodes of that when I was writing the book, and I was just struck by the fact that there was virtually no pop culture or sport at all. It just didn't come up at all. You might get opera or some classical music, but that was as close to sort of entertainment as you got. And it was just really sort of striking, I guess, watching that back to back with watching modern quiz shows, and just thinking just how I mean, it's the same skill, the same concept, but the actual content is just so different.
Yeah. So your story is very much a rise to the top via the game show, quiz show circuit. There wasn't a top level quizzing circuit as there is now, and things like Quiz Nations Asia Pacific didn't exist. So you threw yourself into loads of stuff. You were doing Sale of the Century when you were still like an undergraduate at university, and other shows. I was struck by a number of things you said, which kind of on a theme, and I wonder how much of this is temperament or learned. You talked in Sale of the Century about how when you first saw the buzzer, there was something about the buzzer that kind of almost took you out of the situation, distracted you, but meant you were actually kind of calm rather than worked up. And later on, you talk about watching old recordings of, was it $1 Million Minute? Something like, and how calm you were, looking back at how calm you were. Calmness, I think, and clarity of thought are absolutely essential if you're going to be winning a quiz. Do you think that's kind of that's just naturally in you, or is that something to work at?
I think you probably can work at it, but probably the only way to work at it is to do a lot more of it, and you just become used to it. I think that if you're naturally of that sort of disposition, you probably have a bit of an advantage, because most people, in my experience, going into a television studio sort of environment where it's very unfamiliar, there's cameras and lights, and all of a sudden everyone's watching you. The natural inclination is to sort of get nervous and clam up a bit. And to me, I think because I had just dreamt of that for so long, it was all it was kind of like that. That thing of just you imagine the thing, you imagine what you're going to do, and then you're there, and you're like, all right, that's great. I've imagined this. I know how to do this. The red buzzer on Sale of the Century was I coveted that buzzer. I wanted to press it. I went and sat down for my first episode at the age of 19, and there was this big huge metal bolt in the buzzer that's like right in the middle where you would have to press it, and you couldn't see that on TV. That's the magic of TV. Everything is basically stuck together with sticky tape, although nobody realizes that watching at home. And so I was sort of focused on this buzzer and just thinking, that's not what I thought it would be like, blah blah blah, all this internal dialogue going on in my head. But what that was doing was it was distracting me. It was meaning that I wasn't focusing on the the studio audience or the cameras or the thing that said $250,000 cash jackpot. All of that stuff wasn't sort of distracting me, because I was distracted by something else that was pretty inconsequential. And so once the game got going, I was like, oh yeah, we're playing now, and was just into it. And yeah, the more game shows that I did, I guess, the more just comfortable I felt in those environments. if you have a bit of success on one as well, I think it just makes you sort of go into the next one thinking, well, I've got this advantage over the other contestants. I've been in a similar situation before and I've done quite well. And so they might be nervous because this is their first opportunity, first time in the studio. And so I think that every new show just built and built and built that confidence, because it just meant that by the end of it, I was almost a veteran. I sort of I knew what I was doing when a show called $1 Million Minute came along, and I was in my 30s by then, and I just I just sort of sat down. It was a very similar setup to Sale of the Century, and I just felt this is great. I know what I'm doing here. I feel calm about this, and that is absolutely the headspace for me that you want to be in. You don't want to be you want to have a certain amount of adrenaline, obviously, but you don't want to be so amped up that you're not going to perform well.
And that show gave you a life-changing win. And what I really liked is your wife, is it Zoe?
Yes.
When you were thinking, okay, I'm going to try and get to $200,000 and bail out, and she goes, well, why not go for 300,000 and then we could pay off our mortgage?
Right,
and I think having a touchstone in your life as well, who can almost give you that permission to just go that little bit further, that must be really good and empowering for you in that sort of situation.
Oh, absolutely. And it would have been quite challenging, I think, to have all of that weighing on your mind if I was just doing that on my own and trying to work out am I making a mistake? Should I play on? Should I stop? But having someone to talk it through with, who was also invested in the in the result, obviously, and she just sort of I guess made the point that what's the worst that can happen? I dropped down to a $75,000 level. Okay, that's less than 200, but it's still good money. And we just calculated that 300,000 was we could pay off the mortgage. The one thing about that show that worried me, though, was that it was quite a new show, and I was the first person to get to these sort of levels, and so it was just all absolutely new territory. And I didn't know whether the producers were going to really ramp up the difficulty as you got higher up, the 500,000, all of that. So yes, we talked it over. We thought, all right, I'll go for the 300. I went for the 300 and won the episode, but I was not enjoying it. It was too stressful by then. I knew how much money I had to lose, and so I sort of walked away with that, which was an amazing, life-changing win. And sometimes I wonder if I could have gone on, but equally, I'm very, very happy that I didn't, put myself under that pressure.
Well, it's all worked out very well, because off the back of being one of the most high-profile winners in Australian TV quizzing, you were approached to be a chase. Well, equally, you say in the book, actually, that you cheekily said, you applied to be on the show, but equally also said, but I'd quite fancy to be a chaser if you need one.
That's right.
Did you ever get a sense of whether you were already in the frame, or whether your kind of cheekiness kind of elevated you?
I don't know. So what happened was they were looking at doing the Chase Australia in 2014, and that was basically just after I'd won on $1 Million Minute. And so I applied to be a contestant, but because it was fresh in mind, I'd just won this big amount. I said, but look, I know the Chase UK inside out. I think I could, be a really good, chaser option if you're looking for someone. And nothing ever came of that. They didn't produce the show at the time, so I just sort of, went back to, my regular life. And then a year later, I just sort of got a, contact out of the blue saying, we're doing this show, blah, blah, blah. They didn't say what it was, but it was pretty obviously the Chase. And the audition process went from there. I've never worked out whether anything, whether what I wrote helped at all. My gut feeling is it probably didn't make that much difference, because knowing how these shows work now, I think that application would have just gone to a contestant coordinator, would have been in a pile with a lot of others. The reality is, I think it probably they probably just had a list of people, and I was probably already fresh in mind because my win had been quite recent as well. And I certainly I think there were quite a few people in the mix. So my gut feeling is it probably didn't make that much difference putting in that little cheeky reference, but equally it kind of hurt.
Kind of hurt indeed. Earlier in this interview, you described yourself as an introvert. You describe yourself as an introvert in the book as well. How do you square that with now being in homes in Australia, on a regular basis, via the TV, being recognizable? How is that for you? And do they do anything to prepare you for that level of fame as a TV company?
Look, to be honest, I can't remember whether they did anything to prepare us for that or not. I think that having done a show where I'd won, a good amount quite recently, I'd sort of had a little bit of experience of being recognized from that sort of thing anyway. And because I'm a journalist, I've sort of I've always been pretty active on things like Twitter and so I think if I was not used to that sort of stuff, I think suddenly being one of these people who's the center of attention might have really been a bit jarring. But yeah, doing things like journalism had already taken me out of that comfort zone, I think. I am naturally an introverted person, but as a journalist, I had to force myself to, to talk to people, to ask the questions, to, go into situations that weren't naturally comfortable for me. And it's the same sort of thing with the chase and with TV. It's, but because I love it so much, it doesn't feel as stressful as, if you threw me into some other, situations, I might really, struggle a lot more. But because it's something I love so much, it doesn't really feel like too much of a stretch. Getting recognized is strange. I guess I've just got used to it over the 7 years that we've been on air now. It's always, every now and then someone will say, hello, they recognized me or whatever. But a lot of times people don't say anything. But I just kind of, I've become very good at just sort of picking when you can sort of see them suddenly talk to their friend after they've just passed and point back and look. It's this kind of they think they're being surreptitious about it, but but look, I ultimately I don't mind. It means people are watching the show, which can only be a good thing.
Now, you talked about how your first loss was quite a big one on the chase, but that knowing that it had changed people's lives, and then you go into detail about how it changed people's lives, that kind of softened the pain. But you've been a contestant who's missed out on big prizes in the past. Does that change or influence how you think about the contestants that you beat on the show?
Yeah, it does a bit, because I know that they'll, this is for some of them, this might be their one chance to win on a quiz show. Others will go on other shows. The same people turn up over and again. I always feel for teams who, I think have either maybe, scored a really good score in the final chase, and it just happens that, I've been on my game and have caught it, or maybe I can tell that they've made a mistake that they regret, like they just gave the wrong answer or something, and sometimes that's what costs them. And I do feel for them because I have absolutely been there before. I've stuffed up on a couple of shows that just either silly mistakes or just being unlucky or whatever. And on Sale of the Century, when I got knocked out, on my fourth night at 19 years of age, like I thought I was going to go all the way and win the $250,000. I got beaten in some very unlucky circumstances, and I literally had nightmares about it. Like not figuratively, I literally, dreamt about that experience happening over and over again. But I think that also, on the chase, that has also, I guess, given me a I guess it has just made me think of it from the point of view that okay, this is disappointing for the contestants in this moment,
Mm.
but this will make them all that much better if they have another crack at another show. You know? There's other quiz shows that they can go on. There will be other ones in the future that don't exist yet, and all of these experiences will help them, you know, be a better player for those opportunities. And that's because that's what happened to me. So yeah, I do feel for them in that moment. But that's the game, and I've been on both sides of it.
And yeah, and that's your job. You're paid to win more than you lose. And that there's a lot of rubbish that gets posted online here about the chase, and I don't know whether it's the same in Australia. So let's look at just a few of those myths before we move on. Chasers get easier questions in the final round. Do you get that one?
Sometimes I think that in the UK there's probably a bit more of this goes on social media. I think in Australia people are probably a bit more willing to just kind of watch it and accept it. But that definitely does get mentioned occasionally. I think, and look, I don't work behind the scenes, the question writers at all, but I think what happens is people are comparing our easy questions with the contestants' hard questions. The reality is the contestants also get easy questions, and we also get hard questions. And my like I think that the question writing teams work very hard to make sure that the difficulty levels are all matched up, as clearly as they possibly can be. But you know from just watching the show that the first question in a final chase is going to be a pretty easy one. They like to work people into it. It might be, a really easy, complete this saying kind of question. And so I think sometimes what happens is the viewers will go, oh, well, the chaser had that really easy question, but the contestants got asked about this obscure Shakespeare character. It's like, well, yes, okay. But what about those other hard ones that we also answered later in our chase that you've conveniently forgotten about?
And that you made to look easy.
Yeah, that's right.
So we sometimes get accusations here, particularly in the charity celebrity ones. It's like the chasers deliberately got a question wrong because that's an easy question. I knew it. How could they not know it? And things like that. Would a chaser ever deliberately give a wrong answer?
I can't think of a reason why you would. We don't have the charity ones so much here, but I think again, what's happening there is that's a viewer perceiving something as easy because they know it. It might just be something that falls in their sphere of knowledge that for some reason the chasers haven't come across. And what can happen is that if we all have subjects that we're not that great in, and if we get a relatively easy question in that subject and we get it wrong, someone who's good at that subject is going to watch it and go, oh, that was dead easy. But they don't understand that we're good in a whole lot of other subjects. That might just be the one little area that we're not so good at. So yeah, everything's easy if you know it.
If you know it. And then of course, and you're sat on your couch at home, not under the pressure of studio lights, not having had hours of sitting around doing nothing before having to then go and perform.
Well, that's right. And that's the other thing. We are also human. We make mistakes while we're looking at a question and we're trying to work through the logic of it, or the and sometimes you second guess yourself. Sometimes you think, oh, that almost seems too easy, so maybe it's the other answer instead. And so that happens to us as well.
Yeah. Or you stop listening partway through the question because you think, oh, I know where this is going, and then you miss something that slightly changes the question.
Right.
I think we've all been there. I think quizzes can recognize how this happens. Viewers at home perhaps don't always, but I've known Mark Lebet since 2006. He would never knowingly get a question wrong because, for example, Paul Sinha and Anne and all the chasers. It's just not in your DNA. In fact, I remember going to an audition thinking, no, I really don't need 100% on these questions, so I'll try and make sure I get a few wrong. I found it very difficult to write plausible wrong answers when you know what the answer is. It's
That's
just
right. That's right. Yes. Yeah. No, it's and the reality is I get plenty wrong without trying to. So I'm not going to deliberately get any wrong. That's for sure.
Now, you say in the book that you balk at the suggestion that quizzing is a sport. And then throughout the book, you talk about so many things which kind of resonate with elite sport, preparation, training, how to maintain focus over a long period of time, or indeed, switching it on and switching it off. You even talk about diet and the importance of that, particularly if you're on a tournament or whatever. Does over time, have you changed your thinking on this? I mean, that it is a sport or not a sport?
Look, maybe it's just because I've worked in sports journalism and that sort of thing. To me, a sport is still something that has a physical element to it. It requires a physical skill. So I don't think that chess is a sport personally, because it's competitive. It's a game. It shares those elements with a sport, but you don't have to master a particular physical skill. Now, that's just an arbitrary, that's just my view on what a sport is. There's no right or wrong sort of answer to that. And I sort of view quizzing in the same way. It's competitive and it shares a hell of a lot of characteristics with sport, and particularly as you sort of get to the elite levels of it. But I still think it's, I think I described it as, that they're sort of, they're in the same family tree, and they share a lot of elements, but they're not necessarily in the same branch of the family tree. That said, there are some types of quizzing that probably do require some sort of physical element to it. Like I was sort of saying, Sale of the Century. You had to be so quick on that buzzer. You had to have a physical technique that would help you. So
yeah, because you talk about having it two hands, whereas other people were hovering over and kind of up and down, and so
that's right. So look, it is definitely a bit of a grey area whether it's a sport or not a sport. I tend to lean on the side that it's a game more than a sport. But I don't, if anyone else wants to consider it a sport, I certainly wouldn't argue, because it definitely shares so many elements with sports. And you mentioned sort of switching on and off your focus. Like I wrote about cricket for 10 years as a job, and batters were always saying that they would switch on their focus as the bowler runs in, and then once the ball's been played and dead, they switch off again, and that's how they get through a long innings. And I find that it's the same when you're sitting there for, might be doing 2 or 3 chase episodes sort of back to back. And that's what you have to do, because otherwise by the end of it, you're just so mentally exhausted. You have to be able to switch on and off. So it is the same sort of mindset.
Definitely. Yeah, you can't be switched on the whole time, or it just absolutely drains you. Equally, again, I used to play cricket and open a batting. If you've played a bad shot and you're still there at the end of it, it's the don't dwell on the bad shot you've just played. It's the get rid of it, move on. And it's the same with answering questions. If you're still thinking about the previous question you got wrong when the next one's being asked, you're asking for trouble.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's probably one of my strengths as a quizzer and on the chase. I know I'm not. I don't have knowledge as deep and as so many other people, other elite quizzers necessarily. But one thing that I'm very good at is not letting it get me down when I get one wrong. So I will just go, that's fine, I didn't know it, or I was 50-50 and I went the wrong way. That's all right. That happens. Move on to the next one, because there is absolutely no use dwelling on it in that moment. You can go back after the episode or whatever and think about it and go, all right, well, how could I have got that question right? Is that a subject that I have just sort of not studied where I should have, or was I, sometimes I might have just overthought it, and you can do all of that stuff afterwards. But there's no point getting yourself distracted in that moment, because it's only, what can happen is it just gets worse and worse, and you miss more and more.
Indeed, you get into a spiral. We sit on Mastermind all the time. Somebody passes, and then they're thinking about that one, and then they pass the next one and pass.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a pass spiral. That's we've
yeah.
heard that term used,
Mm,
in quiz shows pretty regularly, and you can see it. It sort of often happens in contestants, cash builders, because
mm,
they're the sort of the sole focus in that time,
mm,
and I think it often happens if they're worried that they've looked silly because they've given
mm,
an incorrect answer to what they might think should have been an easy question. And so
mm,
they kind of start kicking themselves and get a bit embarrassed, and then they're not even
yeah,
listening to the next question,
yeah.
which,
And so you get a question that says which day of the week or which color or
yeah,
which month, and they
yeah,
pass, and it's like, well, at
yeah,
least guess one of them, but
that's right.
they're in
That's
that.
right. Yeah, you can tell. You can often tell when that focus
Mm,
has just gone off in the wrong direction.
yeah.
It happens, yeah, pretty often actually.
Now, of all the quizzes you interviewed for the book, was there one that you particularly admired or took a lot from?
um, yeah, look, I mean, I interviewed a number of different people from different eras and different, quiz show backgrounds, I
Mm,
guess. Uh, you know, I have huge admiration for people like, Issa Schultz, my Chase colleague, the super nerd, and Ross Evans, who's the other Australian quizzer, who
mm,
they're the two who always win the Australian Championship. One or the other will win it. They're always right up, in the high levels of the world,
mm,
quizzing championships. And I have great admiration for, for that, the amount of time that they put in,
mm,
for really, there's obviously no big $1 million prizes in those tournaments. It's just because they want to do better.
yeah,
They want to improve. It's this sort of self-improvement kind of thing, this aiming for the top. So I have great admiration for those guys for doing that,
mm,
because that's something that I don't know. Look,
mm,
I have three pretty small kids, and busy with other work and stuff. It's something that I sort of just don't have the time to kind of focus
mm,
on myself. But I have great admiration for them for doing that.
yeah,
Um, and look, I think some of the other champions that I interviewed, I admire what they did, but I sort of look at it and I kind of think that must have just, you know, that must have really just dominated your life so much that you sort of wonder how the rest of their life functioned at a time when they were
mm,
preparing for a show in such, such great detail.
yeah,
There's a guy who won the $1 million on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in Australia, who studied for 5 years for it, and not just studied trivia and questions. Like, he studied the show. He built a
mm,
database of the questions that were asked on the show so that he could analyze the subjects and everything. And he look, it worked. He won the $1 million. He was incredible. So I admire, that level of commitment to it and following it through. But again, that's something that I personally wouldn't have the
mm,
discipline or the mindset to do. But I admire that other people can set their mind to that.
yeah, absolutely. No, I can share that, that view. And there are some people working ferociously hard right now and improving their quizzing immensely and taking quizzing into kind of new areas, and more power to their elbow. They're doing fine things. But I
Oh,
guess I'd like to
absolutely.
finish with this question, which may or may not be possible to answer. But if the Brydon of 2022 could speak to 15-year-old Brydon before he made that first phone call to the radio show, what would you say to him?
Probably. Well, I don't know. I think I would just say, have fun with this, because it is a game. It's not, it's not life or death. It's not the end of the world. But you are good at this. Just
Mm,
enjoy it, do it, and have fun with it, because
mm,
that's really, I think, how you know, that's how you get to a place with any sort of hobby or sport or anything like that. That's how
mm,
you get to a place where you're in the right mindset do well and enjoy it at the
Mm.
same time. I wouldn't want to be doing something, just because I was good at it when I wasn't enjoying it. I think I would, yeah, I think I would just also say, look, don't beat yourself up when you get things wrong. Everyone does, and that's how you learn. That's how that's how you get better, by making mistakes and just shrugging them off, learning from them, and having another go next time. It's not, particularly with things like TV quiz shows. There is a real tendency to sometimes you make a mistake and you think, oh my god, everybody who watched that is going to think you're such an idiot, all of that sort of stuff. But the reality is, the viewers at home, they'll watch it in that moment, they'll forget about it. They won't remember that you gave what you thought was a silly answer. Just move on, and don't let it get you down, basically.
Yeah, indeed. Very good advice as well. I think a lot of people who get into quiz can be quite get so excited about it, they get very obsessive, and then when they get a blow, then they take it really quite personally, as if it's almost a judgment on them that they got something wrong or lost a competition, and that their self-worth is somehow hit, and it's not. Find the thing that gives you joy, do the thing that gives you joy, and don't beat yourself up if it doesn't go so well.
Absolutely. Yep. Good advice, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Brydon, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to speak to us. Really, really appreciate it. And yeah, best of luck with the chase and whatever might happen in the future. As your story, as your book shows us, there are lots of opportunities in TV and in quizzing, and there are, I'm sure, lots of opportunities to come. So best of luck with that. And if people want to buy the Quiz Masters, Inside the World of Trivia, Obsession and $1 Million Prizes, certainly in the UK, it's available on Amazon. I'm sure Amazon around the world, and no doubt bookshops where such things still exist. But I can recommend it. I can recommend it. I read it and enjoyed it. And thank you so much.
I think it'll be available pretty shortly in an ebook internationally as well. So that's another option.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Brydon.
Thanks, Gareth.